The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and crimson as Lieutenant Commander Jake Hawk Morrison adjusted his tactical gear one final time. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead, creating a dust storm that forced the 8-man SEAL team to squint through their protective eyewear. This was supposed to be a routine extraction mission, but something in Morrison's gut told him otherwise. 2 minutes out! Shouted the crew chief over the engine noise. Morrison looked at his team, 7 of the finest warriors the U.S. Navy had ever produced. There was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Tank Rodriguez, a mountain of a man who could carry twice his body weight and still outrun most recruits. Beside him sat Petty Officer First Class Danny Ghost Chen, their communications specialist who could hack into enemy systems faster than most people could tie their boots. The team also included Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Rabbit Walsh, their explosives expert who had earned his nickname for his quick movements and ability to disappear into tight spaces. Next to him was Hospital Corpsman First Class Michael Doc Patterson, whose medical skills had saved more lives than anyone could count. Petty Officer First Class Alex Iceman Volkov sat calmly checking his sniper rifle, his Russian heritage giving him an edge in these harsh mountain conditions that reminded him of his childhood in Siberia. Rounding out the team were Petty Officer Second Class Carlos Spider Mendoza, an expert climber who could scale any surface, and the youngest member, Petty Officer Third Class Ryan Rookie Thompson, who despite his nickname had already proven himself in 3 previous deployments. "Listen up!" Morrison called out as the helicopter began its descent toward the landing zone. "Intelligence says we've got a high-value target holed up in a compound about 2 clicks from our insertion point. The guy's been coordinating attacks against our convoys for months. Local sources say he's planning something big, and we need to grab him before he can execute whatever he's cooking up." The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. The target, a Taliban commander known as the Ghost of Kandahar, had been tracked to a remote compound nestled high in the mountains. The location was strategic. He could see approaching forces from miles away, but it also made him vulnerable if the right team could get close enough. "What about air support?" Tank asked, his deep voice cutting through the engine noise. "Negative on immediate air support," Morrison replied. "Weather's supposed to turn bad, and Command doesn't want to risk losing aircraft in these mountains. We're going in light and fast. Get the target, get out. Rendezvous at the extraction point in 6 hours." As the helicopter touched down, the team moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Years of training and real combat experience had forged them into something more than just 8 individual soldiers. They were a single unit, each man anticipating the other's movements, covering angles without being told, communicating with hand signals that had become as natural as breathing. The insertion went smoothly. Too smoothly, Morrison thought as he watched the helicopter disappear into the morning sky. The landing zone had been completely quiet. No movement, no signs of enemy activity. In his experience, that usually meant one of 2 things. Either they were walking into an empty area, or they were walking into a trap. The team began their trek toward the compound, moving in a tactical formation that kept them spread out, but within supporting distance of each other. The terrain was brutal, loose rocks that shifted underfoot, steep inclines that burned their legs even through their excellent conditioning, and thin air that made every breath a conscious effort. "Rookie, how you holding up back there?" Morrison asked quietly into his radio as they paused at a ridge line. "Good to go, sir," came Thompson's reply, though Morrison could hear the strain in his voice. The kid was tough, but this was his first high-altitude mission, and the thin air was taking its toll. Doc moved back to check on Thompson, offering him a drink from his water supply and checking his pulse and breathing. "He's fine," Doc reported. "Just needs to adjust his breathing pattern." As they crested another ridge, Spider suddenly held up his fist, the signal to freeze. He had spotted something ahead. Moving like his namesake, he disappeared over the rocks to get a closer look. Moments later, His voice crackled through their earpieces. "Boss, we got a problem. The compound's not just occupied, it's fortified. I'm seeing at least 20 armed fighters, heavy weapons positions, and what looks like prepared defensive positions. This isn't some random hideout. They're ready for war." Morrison felt his stomach drop. Intelligence had said minimal resistance, maybe 4 or 5 fighters at most. 20 armed Taliban with prepared positions was a completely different scenario. "Any sign they've spotted us?" he asked. "Negative. We're still about a click out, and they seem focused on the main approach routes. But boss, there's something else. I'm seeing equipment that doesn't match the usual Taliban gear. This looks professional. Military-grade communications equipment, coordinated defensive positions. These guys have been planning for this." Ghost, monitoring radio frequencies, suddenly spoke up. "Commander, I'm picking up heavy radio chatter. Multiple frequencies, and they're using codes I don't recognize. This is way more organized than anything we've seen from local Taliban cells." Morrison gathered his team behind a cluster of large boulders and studied the aerial photos they'd been given during the briefing. The compound consisted of several buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with high walls and only 2 apparent entrances. It sat on a flat area carved out of the mountainside, with steep drops on 3 sides and only one practical approach route. "Iceman, can you get a better look with your scope?" Morrison asked. Volkov set up his rifle and studied the compound through his high-powered scope. After several minutes of careful observation, he lowered the weapon with a grim expression. "Sir, this is not good. I count at least 25 fighters, possibly more inside the buildings. They have machine gun nests covering all approaches, and I can see mortar positions. Whoever's in charge over there knows what they're doing." Tank spat into the dust. "Sounds like our intelligence was about as accurate as a weather report." Morrison had to make a decision. The mission parameters had changed dramatically, but the target was still vital. The ghost of Kandahar had been responsible for too many American deaths to let him slip away now. "We adapt and overcome," Morrison decided. "Ghost, try to get a message back to command. Let them know the situation has changed and request immediate air support." "Already tried, sir. Something's jamming our long-range communications. I can reach out maybe half a click, but nothing beyond that." The situation was getting worse by the minute. No long-range communications meant no air support, no backup, and no way to call off the mission if things went completely sideways. "Doc, how much medical supplies are you carrying?" Morrison asked. "Enough for minor wounds and field treatment. If we take heavy casualties, we're going to have problems." Morrison studied his men. They were all looking at him expectantly, waiting for orders. These were warriors who had signed up knowing they might face impossible odds, and they trusted him to make the right decision. "Here's what we're going to do," he said finally. "We can't go in the front door. That's suicide. But these mountains are full of caves and crevices. Spider, I want you to find us an alternate route, something that gets us close without walking into their kill zones." Spider nodded and disappeared again, his climbing skills allowing him to move over terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. The rest of the team waited, each man lost in his own thoughts about what they were about to attempt. 20 minutes later, Spider returned with mixed news. "Found a route, but it's not pretty. There's a narrow ledge that runs along the eastern face of the mountain. It's maybe 18 inches wide in places, with about a 1,000-foot drop if you slip. But it leads to a position where we can overlook the compound." "How long to traverse?" Morrison asked. "Maybe 2 hours, moving carefully, and that's if the weather holds." As if summoned by his words, a cold wind began to pick up, carrying with it the smell of snow from the higher peaks. The weather that had grounded their air support was moving in faster than predicted. Morrison made his decision. "We take the ledge. Move out in 5 minutes." The ledge was every bit as treacherous as Spider had described. The team moved in single file, pressed against the rock face, with hundreds of feet of empty air yawning below them. Tank, despite his size, moved with surprising grace, while Rookie struggled with the exposure, his face pale with fear. "Don't look down, kid," Doc whispered during one of their rest stops. "Focus on the rock in front of you, nothing else." 2 hours later, they reached Spider's objective, a rocky outcropping that provided an excellent view of the compound below. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. The compound was a fortress. Machine gun positions covered every approach. Fighters moved with military precision, and the defensive positions had been carefully planned by someone with real tactical knowledge. This wasn't a ragtag Taliban cell. This was a professional military operation. "Sir," Ghost said quietly, "I'm picking up communications that suggest they know we're here. Not our exact position, but they're definitely aware that American forces are in the area." Morrison felt the walls closing in. They were trapped on a narrow ledge, outnumbered at least 3-1 with no communications and no backup. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, making their precarious position even more dangerous. "Options?" he asked his team. "We could try to work our way back," Tank suggested, but they all knew that traversing the ledge again, especially with weather moving in, would be nearly impossible. "We could set up a sniper position here," Iceman offered. "I might be able to take out some of their key personnel. Cause enough confusion for an assault." Morrison was about to respond when Ghost suddenly stiffened, pressing his hand against his earpiece. "Sir, I'm picking up something. Local radio traffic, but it's not Taliban. Someone else is in these mountains." The team exchanged glances. Another American unit? Special operations from another country, or something worse? "Can you determine location?" Morrison asked. Ghost worked with his equipment for several minutes before shaking his head. "Negative, sir. The signal's too weak and intermittent, but whoever it is, they're close." As if things weren't complicated enough, now they had an unknown third party in the area. Morrison felt the weight of command pressing down on him like the gathering storm clouds above. The wind picked up again, and the first flakes of snow began to fall. In another hour, the ledge would become treacherous even for experienced climbers. They needed to make a decision soon, or the decision would be made for them by the weather. Morrison gathered his team around him and studied the compound one more time. The target was down there somewhere, probably in the central building based on the defensive positions around it. Getting to him would require fighting through multiple defensive positions, and getting out would be nearly impossible. But that was the mission, and SEALs don't leave missions unfinished. "Here's the plan," Morrison began, but his words were cut off by the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle echoing through the mountains. All 8 men instinctively ducked, looking around for the source of the shot. In the compound below, one of the machine gun positions suddenly went silent. The gunner slumped forward, clearly hit by sniper fire from an unknown location. "Where the hell did that come from?" Tank whispered. The Taliban fighters in the compound were asking the same question, scrambling for cover and pointing weapons in all directions, but they couldn't locate the shooter any more than the SEALs could. Another shot rang out, and a second fighter dropped. The shot had come from a completely different direction than the first, suggesting the shooter had moved between shots. "Ghost, are you picking up anything?" Morrison asked urgently. "Negative, sir. Whoever this is, they're maintaining radio silence." The situation had just become infinitely more complicated. Someone else was in these mountains. Someone with exceptional shooting skills and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Friend or enemy, Morrison couldn't tell, but for the moment, the mysterious sniper was certainly causing problems for the Taliban. A third shot echoed through the mountains, and Morrison watched through his binoculars as panic began to spread through the compound. The disciplined defensive positions were starting to break down as fighters sought cover from an enemy they couldn't see. "Sir," Rookie said quietly, "this might be our chance. While they're distracted, we could make our move." Morrison considered it. The mysterious sniper had certainly created an opportunity, but it could also be a trap. Without knowing who was doing the shooting or what their intentions were, any move the SEALs made could put them in even more danger. The snow was falling harder now, and visibility was starting to decrease. Soon, their position on the ledge would become untenable regardless of what they decided to do about the mission. Morrison looked at his men, 7 faces staring back at him, waiting for orders that could determine whether they all went home or whether some of them would be left behind in these mountains. The weight of command had never felt heavier. The mysterious sniper fired again, and Morrison made his decision. Whatever happened next, they were committed now. There was no going back. Morrison's decision came with the 5th shot from the mysterious sniper. Another Taliban fighter dropped, and the compound erupted into chaos as fighters scrambled for better cover. The SEAL commander knew opportunity when he saw it, even if he didn't understand where it was coming from. "We move now," Morrison commanded. "Spider, lead us down to that rocky area about 200 meters below the compound. Tank, you and Ghost set up a base of fire position. Iceman, find yourself a shooting position with good fields of fire. Everyone else, we're going for the central building." The team began their descent from the ledge, moving as quickly as safety would allow. The mysterious sniper continued firing, each shot precise and devastating to the Taliban's defensive positions. Morrison counted at least 8 enemy fighters down, and the remainder were clearly rattled. But their mysterious allies' intervention came with its own problems. As the team worked their way down the mountainside, Morrison realized they were moving into a potential crossfire situation. They knew nothing about the sniper's intentions, capabilities, or even location. For all they knew, the SEALs could be the next targets. "Sir," Ghost whispered as they reached the rocky area Spider had identified. "I'm picking up Taliban radio chatter. They're calling for reinforcements. Sounds like they've got another 20 fighters about 30 minutes out." Morrison felt his stomach tighten. They were already outnumbered, and now more enemy forces were on the way. The window of opportunity the mysterious sniper had created was rapidly closing. The team set up their assault positions with practiced efficiency. Tank positioned his light machine gun behind a cluster of boulders that provided excellent cover and clear fields of fire toward the compound's main entrance. Ghost established communications with the rest of the team and began monitoring enemy radio frequencies. Iceman found a shooting position about 50 meters higher up the slope, where he could provide overwatch for the assault team. His sniper rifle would be crucial in picking off key targets and providing precision fire support. Doc prepared his medical supplies and established a casualty collection point in a protected area behind Tank's position. Spider began planning climbing routes that could provide alternate escape paths if their primary extraction route was compromised. Rookie, despite his nervousness about the altitude and exposure, checked his equipment one final time and prepared to follow Morrison into the compound. The mysterious sniper fired again, this time taking out what appeared to be a Taliban commander who had been trying to restore order to the defensive positions. The shot had come from the eastern ridge, at least 800 meters away. A difficult shot under the best conditions, nearly impossible in the growing wind and snow. "Whoever that is can really shoot," Iceman observed with professional appreciation. That was at least an 800-meter shot in challenging conditions. Morrison studied the compound through his binoculars. The Taliban fighters were clearly confused and demoralized by the sniper attacks, but they were still dangerous. Machine gun positions still covered the main approaches, and Morrison could see fighters moving to reinforce the central building where their target was most likely located. "Tank, can you suppress that machine gun position at the main gate?" Morrison asked. "Roger that, sir. Give me 30 seconds to get a good sight picture." Tank's machine gun opened up with a sustained burst that forced the Taliban gunners to duck behind their sandbag positions. At the same time, Iceman engaged targets on the compound's walls, his precision rifle picking off fighters who exposed themselves to return fire. Morrison led Rookie and Spider in a dash toward the compound's rear wall, where intelligence photos had shown a small maintenance entrance. The distraction provided by Tank and Iceman was working. Most of the Taliban fighters were focused on the obvious threat from the front, not watching for infiltrators coming from behind. The mysterious sniper continued firing, but Morrison noticed something troubling. The shots were no longer coming from the eastern ridge. Somehow, the sniper had moved to a completely different position without anyone seeing them. That level of fieldcraft suggested serious training and experience. "Ghost. Any luck raising command?" Morrison asked as they reached the rear wall of the compound. "Negative, sir. Still jammed. But I'm picking up something interesting on the Taliban frequencies. They're as confused about our sniper friend as we are. They keep talking about the ghost shooter and trying to coordinate a response, but they can't figure out where the shots are coming from either." Morrison felt a small measure of relief. At least the mystery sniper wasn't working with the Taliban. Whether that made them friend or foe remained to be seen, but for now, their interests seemed aligned. Spider quickly rigged a small explosive charge on the maintenance door, while Morrison and Rookie provided security. The charge was barely powerful enough to blow the lock. They couldn't risk a large explosion that would alert the entire compound to their presence. The door swung open, revealing a narrow corridor that led into the central building. Intelligence had been accurate about the layout at least. Morrison entered first, his weapon at the ready, followed by Rookie and Spider. The interior of the building was darker than expected, lit only by a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The walls were rough concrete, and the floors were covered with worn carpets that muffled their footsteps. Morrison could hear voices speaking in Pashto coming from somewhere deeper in the building. They moved carefully through a series of narrow corridors, checking each room they passed. Most were empty, but one contained what appeared to be a communication center with sophisticated equipment that definitely didn't belong to a typical Taliban cell. Ghost had been right. This operation was far more professional than their intelligence had suggested. "Sir," Rookie whispered, pointing down a corridor that led toward the center of the building. "I can hear multiple voices from that direction." Morrison nodded and led the way toward the voices. The corridor opened into a larger room where they could see 3 Taliban fighters gathered around a table covered with maps and documents. One of them was speaking rapidly into a satellite phone, clearly the high-value target they had come to capture. Morrison hand-signaled for Spider to circle around to the left, while he and Rookie approached from the right. They needed to take these 3 alive, if possible, especially the one with the phone, who was almost certainly their primary target. But as they prepared to move, the building suddenly shook with the impact of an explosion somewhere nearby. The lights went out, plunging the interior into near-complete darkness. Emergency battery-powered lights kicked in, casting eerie shadows throughout the room. "What was that?" one of the Taliban fighters shouted in accented English. "Americans! They're inside the compound!" another voice replied. Morrison realized their assault had been discovered. Tank and Iceman's suppressing fire had been effective, but it had also revealed their position and intentions. The Taliban were now fully alert and mobilizing their defenses. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Morrison could hear boots running through the corridors, voices shouting orders, and the distinctive sound of weapons being readied for combat. Their element of surprise was gone. "Ghost, we need immediate extraction," Morrison called into his radio as he and his team prepared to engage the 3 fighters in the room. "Sir, Tank's position is taking heavy fire," Ghost replied. "They've got us pinned down, and I'm reading at least 15 fighters moving to surround our position." The mysterious sniper fired again, this time from what sounded like a position much closer to the compound. Another Taliban fighter dropped, but Morrison could hear more voices shouting as reinforcements arrived from outside the compound. Morrison made a split-second decision. The mission had gone sideways, but they still had a chance to grab their target if they moved fast. He signaled for Spider and Rookie to move, and the 3 SEALs burst into the room where the Taliban fighters were positioned. The firefight was intense but brief. The Taliban fighters were experienced, but they were caught off guard by the sudden assault. Within seconds, 2 of them were down, and the third, the man with the satellite phone, was wounded, but alive. "Target secured," Morrison called into his radio as he zip-tied the wounded Taliban commander. "But we've got problems. This whole place is about to be swarming with hostiles." "Sir, we've got bigger problems." Ghost's voice crackled through the radio with barely controlled panic. "Those reinforcements I mentioned? They're not just Taliban. I'm seeing equipment and tactics that suggest foreign military advisors. We're not just outnumbered, we're outgunned." Morrison's blood ran cold. Foreign advisors meant this operation was much bigger than anyone had realized. They weren't dealing with a local Taliban cell. They had stumbled into something that could have international implications. "Can we get to your position?" Morrison asked. "Negative, sir. They've got us completely surrounded. Tank's doing his best, but we're burning through ammunition fast, and there's nowhere to withdraw to." Morrison looked around the room they were in. The maps on the table showed detailed layouts of American bases throughout the region, along with convoy routes and patrol schedules. Whatever operation they had disrupted, it was big enough to justify the level of security they were facing. "Spider, can you get us out through the way we came in?" Morrison asked. Spider checked the corridor they had used to enter the building. "Negative, sir. I can hear at least 6 fighters between us and that door." They were trapped. Morrison had led his team into a situation that was rapidly becoming untenable, and their support elements were pinned down outside. The mysterious sniper was still active. Morrison could hear the distinctive crack of the rifle every few minutes. But one sniper, no matter how skilled, couldn't turn the tide against these odds. "Doc, what's your status?" Morrison called into his radio. "I'm okay for now, sir, but I can't reach Tank's position. There's too much fire between us." Morrison tried to think of options, but they were running out fast. They had their target, but they were trapped inside a building surrounded by hostiles, with no clear route to their teammates and no way to call for backup. That's when the building shook again, this time much more violently. Something had exploded very close by, and Morrison could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. "Sir," Rookie said quietly, "I think they're about to bring this building down on top of us." Morrison realized the Taliban had made a tactical decision. Rather than risk losing their commander in a prolonged firefight, they were going to destroy the building with everyone inside it. It was a brutal calculus, but effective. "We need to move now," Morrison decided. "Spider, what's the fastest route out of this building?" "There's a window in the next room that looks out over the eastern slope. If we can get there, we might be able to climb down the outside of the building." "Do it." Spider led them through a connecting door into a smaller room that contained several filing cabinets and a desk covered with more documents. The window was narrow but large enough for a man to fit through. Spider looked out the window and immediately ducked back. "Sir, we've got a problem. There are at least 10 fighters positioned down there, and they're watching this exact window." Another mortar round impacted nearby, this one close enough to shower them with debris from the ceiling. Morrison could hear the building's structure groaning under the stress of the explosions. "Tank, what's your ammunition status?" Morrison called into his radio. "Running low, sir. Maybe 5 minutes of sustained fire left." "Iceman?" "Same here, sir. And I'm starting to take fire from multiple directions. They've figured out my position." Morrison closed his eyes for a moment, trying to think of any option they hadn't considered. They had their target, but what good was completing the mission if none of them survived to report what they had found? That's when a new voice broke through the radio static, a voice Morrison didn't recognize, speaking with a slight accent he couldn't immediately place. "SEAL Team, this is Overwatch. I have eyes on your position and am prepared to provide immediate fire support. Acknowledge if you can hear this transmission." Morrison exchanged glances with his teammates. The mysterious sniper was finally communicating with them. "Overwatch, this is SEAL Team Leader. We can hear you. Who are you, and what's your situation?" "SEAL Leader, identification is not important right now. What's important is getting you out of there alive. I count approximately 30 hostiles around your building, with more approaching from the south. You have maybe 10 minutes before they overrun your position completely." The voice was calm and professional, clearly someone with military experience. But Morrison still had no idea who this person was or why they were helping. "Overwatch, can you provide suppressing fire for an extraction?" "Affirmative, SEAL leader. But you're going to have to trust me and follow my instructions exactly. Any deviation from my directions will result in casualties." "Are you prepared to do that?" Morrison looked at his team. Rookie was pale but determined. Spider was already checking his equipment, and their wounded Taliban prisoner was conscious, but not an immediate threat. Outside, he could hear the firefight intensifying as Tank and the others tried to hold their positions. "Overwatch, we don't have a choice. What do you need us to do?" "First, I need you to create a distraction. In 60 seconds, I want you to throw smoke grenades out of that eastern window and then immediately move to the western side of the building. Do not look out any windows on the western side until I give you the all clear." Morrison didn't hesitate. "Roger that, Overwatch. 60 seconds. He quickly explained the plan to his team. They had smoke grenades, but using them would also obscure their own vision. They would be moving blind, trusting their lives to a sniper they had never seen and knew nothing about. 30 seconds, came the calm voice over the radio. Morrison pulled the pin on his smoke grenade and prepared to throw it. Whatever happened next, they were committed. "Execute," the voice said. Morrison threw the smoke grenade out the eastern window while Spider threw a second one. Dense white smoke immediately began billowing around that side of the building. The effect was immediate. Morrison could hear shouts of confusion from the Taliban fighters outside, and the volume of gunfire directed at the building increased dramatically as the hostiles tried to shoot at shadows in the smoke. "Moving to western side," Morrison reported as he led his team through the building toward the opposite wall. "Good. Now, in 15 seconds, I want you to breach that western wall. Use explosives if you have them. When the wall comes down, move immediately to your left and get behind the stone wall you'll see about 20 meters away. Do not stop. Do not look back. And do not engage any targets. I will handle suppression." Spider quickly rigged another small explosive charge on the western wall. Morrison could hear helicopters in the distance, but couldn't tell if they were friendly or hostile. 5 seconds, Overwatch announced. "Remember, breach, move left, stone wall, do not engage." Spider's charge detonated, blowing a hole in the wall large enough for them to move through. Morrison grabbed their prisoner and shoved him through the hole first, then followed with his team right behind him. As soon as they emerged from the building, Morrison understood why Overwatch had been so specific about not engaging targets. Taliban fighters were positioned all around the building, but they were all facing the wrong direction, focused on the smoke-covered eastern side. The SEAL team ran toward the stone wall Overwatch had mentioned, dragging their prisoner with them. Behind them, Morrison could hear the mysterious sniper engaging targets with rapid, precise fire. They reached the stone wall and dove behind it just as Taliban fighters began to realize they had been outflanked. Bullets began hitting the stones above their heads, but they were in solid cover. "Phase 1 complete," Overwatch announced. "Now comes the hard part." Behind the stone wall, Morrison pressed himself against the cold rock as bullets whistled overhead. The Taliban fighters had finally realized they had been outmaneuvered, and their anger was evident in the increasing volume of fire directed at the SEALs' position. The mysterious Overwatch continued engaging targets with methodical precision, each shot dropping another hostile. "SEAL leader, I need you to look to your northeast," Overwatch's voice crackled through the radio. "Do you see the rocky outcropping about 300 meters away?" Morrison carefully peered around the edge of the wall. Through the swirling snow, he could just make out a cluster of large boulders on higher ground. "I see it, Overwatch. That's where we're going, but first, I need to extract your teammates from their positions. Can you provide covering fire for approximately 2 minutes? Morrison checked his ammunition. They had enough for a sustained firefight, but not much more than that. Affirmative, Overwatch, but we're going to need resupply after that. Understood. On my mark. Provide suppressing fire toward the compound's main entrance. Keep their heads down, but don't expose yourselves unnecessarily. Morrison signaled to Spider and Rookie, then prepared to coordinate their fire with the mysterious sniper. Their Taliban prisoner remained quiet, clearly understanding that his survival depended on staying cooperative. Mark, Overwatch announced. Morrison and his team opened fire on the compound, their weapons chattering as they sent controlled bursts toward the Taliban positions. The effect was immediate. Hostile fighters dove for cover, giving Overwatch the opportunity to engage targets that had been suppressing Tank's position. Through the chaos of the firefight, Morrison heard something that made his blood run cold, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors approaching fast. Overwatch, we've got inbound aircraft, Morrison reported. I hear them, SEAL leader. Unfortunately, they're not friendly. Taliban reinforcements with at least 2 transport helicopters and what sounds like an attack bird. Morrison felt his stomach drop. They were already outnumbered and outgunned on the ground. Air support for the Taliban would make their situation hopeless. How long until they arrive? Morrison asked. 5 minutes, maybe less. Morrison watched as Tank and Doc began moving from their position, using the covering fire to bound toward the stone wall where the assault team had taken cover. Ghost and Iceman were doing the same from their positions, moving in short rushes between cover. But the incoming helicopters changed everything. Morrison could see Taliban fighters emerging from covered positions, apparently emboldened by the knowledge that air support was arriving. This is going to be close, Morrison muttered. Tank and Doc reached the stone wall first, diving behind the protective rocks just as machine gun fire from the compound intensified. Tank immediately set up his weapon and began returning fire, giving Iceman and Ghost the covering fire they needed to complete their movement. All elements consolidated, Morrison reported as his team reunited behind the stone wall. But we've got problems. Ammunition is running low. We've got no long-range communications, and those helicopters are going to be here in minutes. Understood, SEAL leader, Overwatch replied. I'm going to need you to trust me completely for what happens next. When I give the word, I want your entire team to move toward that rocky outcropping I showed you. Move fast and don't stop for anything. I'll provide cover. Morrison looked at his men. Tank was bleeding from a shrapnel wound on his arm, but still combat effective. Doc was treating Rookie for what appeared to be a minor head wound from flying stone chips. Ghost was monitoring radio frequencies, and Iceman was conserving his remaining ammunition for when it would be most needed. Sir, Ghost said quietly, I'm picking up those helicopter transmissions now. Definitely Taliban, and they're coordinating with ground forces for a final assault on our position. Morrison could hear the helicopters getting closer. Soon, they would be overhead, and the stone wall that was protecting them would become a trap. Overwatch, we're ready to move on your command. Roger that. In 30 seconds, I'm going to engage the lead helicopter with armor-piercing rounds. When you see it start smoking, that's your cue to move. Head straight for the outcropping, and don't look back. Morrison couldn't believe what he was hearing. Overwatch was planning to engage a helicopter with a sniper rifle. It was theoretically possible, but it would require exceptional skill and luck. Overwatch, are you sure about engaging that aircraft? SEAL leader, I've done this before. Trust me. The helicopters were overhead now, and Morrison could see Taliban fighters preparing for a final assault on their position. They were out of time and options. The distinctive crack of Overwatch's rifle echoed through the mountains, followed immediately by another shot, then a third. Morrison looked up to see sparks flying from the lead helicopter as armor-piercing rounds found their target. Smoke began pouring from the aircraft's engine compartment, and the pilot immediately began looking for a place to make an emergency landing. The second helicopter veered away, its crew clearly not wanting to share the same fate. "Now!" Overwatch commanded. "Move now!" Morrison led his team in a sprint toward the rocky outcropping, dragging their Taliban prisoner with them. Behind them, he could hear Taliban fighters emerging from their positions to pursue, but Overwatch's rifle continued firing, dropping anyone who exposed themselves. The 300-meter run felt like 3 miles. The thin mountain air made every breath a struggle, and the loose rock surface threatened to send them tumbling with each step. Rookie stumbled twice, but Doc helped him keep moving. They reached the outcropping just as the damaged helicopter crashed into the mountainside about half a mile away, sending up a huge plume of smoke and flame. The second helicopter was circling warily, its crew clearly unwilling to risk the same fate. "Good work, SEAL Team," came Overwatch's voice. "Now look to your immediate left. There's a cave entrance hidden behind those fallen rocks." Morrison looked where Overwatch had indicated and saw what appeared to be a natural cave formed by several large boulders that had fallen together. It would provide excellent cover from both ground forces and aircraft. The team moved into the cave, which proved to be larger than it appeared from outside. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they could see that the cave extended back into the mountain for at least 50 feet. "Overwatch, where are you?" Morrison asked. "We need to coordinate our next move." "I'm moving to your position now, SEAL leader. Give me 2 minutes." Morrison posted security at the cave entrance while the rest of the team checked their equipment and ammunition. The situation was still desperate. They were trapped in the mountains with hostile forces closing in, limited ammunition, and no way to call for backup. Doc finished treating Tank's arm wound and moved on to check Rookie's head injury. Both men were still combat effective, but they had all taken a beating during the firefight and subsequent movement. "Sir," Ghost said quietly, "I'm still picking up Taliban radio chatter. They're organizing search teams to hunt for us, and they've called in additional reinforcements from 2 nearby compounds." Morrison felt the weight of command pressing down on him. He had led his team into an impossible situation, and now their survival depended on a mysterious sniper they knew nothing about. 2 minutes later, they heard movement at the cave entrance. Tank raised his weapon, but Morrison signaled for him to wait. "SEAL Team, this is Overwatch. I'm approaching your position from the northeast." A figure appeared at the cave entrance, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in this terrain. As the person stepped into the dim light of the cave, Morrison felt his jaw drop. Overwatch was a woman. She was tall and lean, dressed in military-style camouflage that was perfectly suited to the Rocky Mountain environment. Her long, dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her face showed the kind of weathered confidence that came from years of operating in harsh conditions. Most importantly, she was carrying a custom sniper rifle that looked like it had been modified for extreme long-range precision shooting. "Gentlemen," she said in accented English. "I apologize for the dramatic introduction. My name is Captain Elena Kozlova, former Russian Spetsnaz, currently operating as an independent contractor." Morrison's mind raced. A former Russian Special Forces operator was helping them escape from Taliban forces in Afghanistan. The geopolitical implications were staggering. "Ma'am," Morrison said carefully, "we appreciate your assistance. But I have to ask, what are you doing here?" Kozlova smiled grimly. "Long story, Commander. The short version is that the man you captured has been causing problems for more than just American forces. He's been coordinating attacks against anyone who opposes his particular brand of extremism, including Russian interests in the region." She gestured toward their Taliban prisoner, who had remained silent throughout the firefight and movement. "That man is responsible for the deaths of over 200 people in the past 6 months, including civilians from multiple countries. When intelligence sources indicated an American Special Operations team was moving against him, I decided to provide assistance." Tank spoke up. Ma'am, no disrespect, but how did you know we were coming? I've been tracking this target for 3 weeks, Kozlova explained. When I intercepted communications indicating your mission, I positioned myself to provide support if needed, which, as it turns out, was a good decision. Morrison was still processing this information when Ghost suddenly stiffened. Sir, I'm picking up helicopter sounds again. Multiple aircraft approaching fast. Kozlova moved to the cave entrance and listened for a moment. That's not Taliban, she said with relief. Those are American helicopters. Morrison felt a surge of hope. How can you tell? Different rotor signatures, and more importantly, I called them. Morrison stared at her. You called them? How? Kozlova held up a satellite communication device that was far more sophisticated than anything the SEALs were carrying. Long-range communications have been one of my priorities in this region. I contacted your command structure about 30 minutes ago and provided them with our location and situation. The sound of helicopters grew louder, and Morrison could see aircraft approaching through the cave entrance. 2 Apache attack helicopters were providing escort for what appeared to be several Black Hawk transport aircraft. SEAL Team, this is Dustoff 77, came a familiar voice over Morrison's radio. We have you in sight and are preparing to extract. Be advised, we have multiple hostile forces converging on your position. Morrison felt a wave of relief wash over him. Against all odds, they were going to make it out. Dustoff 77, this is SEAL Team Leader. We have 1 high-value prisoner and 1 friendly contractor. Request immediate extraction. Roger that, SEAL Leader. We're going to need you to move to a landing zone about 200 meters south of your current position. Apache birds will provide suppression. Kozlova was already moving toward the cave entrance. The landing zone is clear terrain with good approaches, she said. But we'll be exposed during the movement. Morrison gathered his team. Final push, gentlemen. Tank, can you carry the prisoner? Yes, sir. Iceman, you and Ghost provide rear security. Doc, stay with Rookie and make sure he doesn't fall behind. Spider, you're with me and Captain Kozlova at point. The team moved out of the cave and began their final movement toward the extraction point. The Apache helicopters had already begun engaging Taliban positions with their chain guns, keeping hostile forces pinned down. But the Taliban weren't giving up easily. Morrison could see fighters moving through the rocks trying to get into position to engage the helicopters or the fleeing Americans. Kozlova moved with the team but occasionally stopped to engage targets with her rifle. Her shooting was incredible. Morrison watched her drop a Taliban fighter at over 600 meters while moving at a tactical pace. How long have you been operating in these mountains? Morrison asked as they bounded from cover to cover. 6 months, Kozlova replied while scanning for targets. This region has become a focal point for international terrorism, and my government has interests in seeing certain problems resolved. They reached the landing zone just as the first Black Hawk touched down. The helicopter's crew chief waved them aboard while door gunners provided suppressing fire. Morrison's team loaded quickly, with Tank carrying their prisoner and Doc helping Rookie into the aircraft. Kozlova was the last aboard, continuing to provide overwatch until the helicopter began to lift off. As the Black Hawk gained altitude, Morrison looked down at the mountains below. Taliban fighters were emerging from their hiding places, firing futilely at the departing aircraft. The compound where they had been trapped was burning, and smoke from the crashed helicopter was still visible. Sir, Ghost said over the intercom, I'm getting reports that ground forces found significant intelligence materials in that compound. Looks like we disrupted something much bigger than just one Taliban commander. Morrison nodded, but his attention was focused on Kozlova. The Russian woman was cleaning her rifle with practiced efficiency, her expression unreadable. Captain, Morrison said over the helicopter's noise, what happens now? Kozlova looked up from her weapon. Now you take your prisoner back to your superiors, and I return to my own mission. This was a temporary cooperation based on mutual interests. Will we see you again? Kozlova smiled. Commander, in this business, you never know who you'll meet in the mountains. The helicopter flew south toward the American base, carrying 8 exhausted SEALs, 1 Taliban prisoner, and 1 enigmatic Russian sniper who had appeared from nowhere to save them from certain death. 3 hours later, as Morrison sat in the debriefing room at Bagram Air Base, he was still trying to process everything that had happened. Their Taliban prisoner had already provided valuable intelligence about planned attacks against coalition forces. The documents recovered from the compound had revealed a sophisticated network of international terrorists operating throughout the region. But the questions about Captain Elena Kozlova remained unanswered. Official inquiries had confirmed that someone matching her description had indeed been operating in the region, and that Russian intelligence had been tracking the same targets as U.S. forces. However, when Morrison asked about making contact with her again, he was told that Captain Kozlova had already disappeared back into the mountains, returning to whatever mission had brought her to Afghanistan in the first place. Tank summed up the entire experience during their final team briefing. Sir, I've been doing this job for 15 years and I've never seen shooting like that. When we were trapped on that ledge, I thought we were all dead men. That woman saved our lives. Morrison nodded. The official after-action report would focus on the successful capture of a high-value target and the disruption of a major terrorist operation. But Morrison would never forget the moment when a lone woman sniper had emerged from the Afghan mountains to rescue an entire SEAL team from certain death. Months later, Morrison would occasionally receive intelligence reports about successful operations against terrorist targets in remote mountain regions. The operations were always attributed to unknown friendly forces, but Morrison recognized the precision and effectiveness of the mysterious sniper who had saved their lives. In the mountains of Afghanistan, legends were born from moments of incredible courage and skill. The story of the woman who had single-handedly rescued 8 U.S. Navy SEALs would become one of those legends, passed down through the special operations community as a reminder that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. Morrison never saw Elena Kozlova again, but he never stopped scanning the ridgelines whenever he operated in mountain terrain. Somewhere out there, a Russian sniper was still fighting the same war against terrorism, and Morrison knew that if their paths ever crossed again, she would once again prove to be the most deadly ally any soldier could hope for. The mountains of Afghanistan had witnessed countless battles, but few as dramatic as the day 8 Navy SEALs cried, "We're trapped," until a solo woman sniper rescued them from the peak.